carry the heavy water.
No, but your question is very well put. The obvious role, the president's the president. But the question around town is, will he simply preside, often as Ronald Reagan presided, and Dick Cheney and others will make all those easy decisions? Or will he get into it a little bit? If you use, say, Bill Clinton or maybe Jimmy Carter in another sense at the other extreme, just doing everything. And another question, Peter, is who has the power below that from the standpoint of foreign policy and defense? Colin Powell, of course, at the State Department, and Donald Rumsfeld at Defense. But Powell had made it clear that he would like to have had an imprint as the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on Defense. And so already you're seeing in the administration at least a lot of questions as to how it's going to sort out.
What kind of... we know that General Powell was a very political general, in fact, somewhat resented by George W. Bush's father, former President Bush, for going around him to the pages of the newspapers during the great debate about Bosnia. Do we think he'll play that active a role, or will Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld at the Defense Department?
Well, I know that Colin Powell came to the State Department to play an active role. As you point out, he's a political man. He was jumped over 43 senior military officers to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he wants to help set foreign policy, not just go as somebody, in the former days of a striped pants. But Rumsfeld is a major player. The former Secretary of Defense is not going to just roll over to this former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And so in trying to look at such diverse matters as the new Star Wars proposal, such as it's going to be, because they're going to have to modify to some extent what the president said during his campaign about that, in trying to look at the use of American force, because Powell is reluctant, as you know, Peter, the Powell Doctrine, to use American military force except under very strong conditions of national security and having an exit strategy and being able to win whatever you're doing. I think that Cheney, as you saw during the Gulf War, and Powell had some disagreements over the use of force. In fact, there's one story, Peter, that General Powell had to be ordered at one point to come up with the military proposals in case, it had to be used against Saddam Hussein.
Certainly an enormously popular character in the country in his support of George W. Bush in the campaign. Wasn't at his side all the time, but whenever he appeared, it was to reinforce George W. Bush's image of a serious man, taken seriously by this man, Colin Powell, who was so popular in the country. Mark Harper, let me ask you briefly about the new president's chief of staff, Andrew Card, another man with considerable experience. What kind of a tone does he like to set in the White House? How will they do business?
He's been very low profile. He's an extraordinarily good manager, and I think that's the main reason he was chosen. Not particularly ideological, very popular in the party, close to the Bush family. And I think you'll see him basically run the White House operation with a maturity and a level of experience that President Clinton did not have at the beginning of his administration.
And John Kasich, former Congressman John Kasich, we see on the streets here now lots of hail to the thief. We see lots of anti-Bush demonstrators having placed themselves at various places in the district so they can't be missed by television cameras today. Do you sense that profound level of partisanship coming into the Congress?
Well, Peter, no, I think street protests now are becoming the order of the day, whether it's World Economic meetings, whether it's in Seattle or in Europe or here at Inauguration. These people are becoming professional at being able to try to disrupt and be heard. But I think the issue is, you ask, what is George Bush's role going to be? Can he just sit in the background? The answer is no. The reason is, Peter, both political parties today have begun their fight for control of the Congress in 2002, and the margins in the Congress are much closer. It's going to take skill and charm by George Bush to try to bring Democrats in and to get them to focus on his big ideas in order to get them to not focus on the next election. This is going to be the challenge. Oh, sure, government's going to run and the appropriation bills are going to pass, but will George Bush's big ideas of significant reductions in taxes, including marginal rates, will that pass? Will we get school vouchers? Will we get some major solution to Social Security? right now, the Republican Party is nervous about taking big steps because they might lose control, being blamed by Democrats for bad political steps. The Democrats the same way. They are hungry to win back both the House and the Senate. And it will take everything that George Bush has to charm the Democrats to bring them in. And frankly, in order to get that done, he's going to have to invite Democrats in early. You just don't show up at the end and say, vote for my program. They have to be included, and he has to be forceful. He can compromise, but I have to tell you, he's the President of the United States, and he deserves a major piece of what he's asking for. Finally, Peter, the closeness of the margins in both the House and the Senate is what is driving all this partisanship. As soon as one party wins a significant election with a significant electoral gain, and the other party is willing to recognize their minority status, things will settle down. But until that time, I don't think you're going to see much major things accomplished, and that George Bush is a wizard. He might be. We'll have to see.
John, let me interrupt you for a second, because here you do get an absolute classic example of how, whether they become more professional or there are more of them, but here you see a moment along the parade route of enormous intensity, and even looking at it on the television monitors here, you can feel the tension in all of the Secret Service on the periphery, all of them hanging on to the edges of the cars immediately behind the president. It is pretty hard, whatever we think of their professional ability, to miss and mishearing the intensity of partisanship and antagonism, at least at this particular point on the parade route. It will certainly change as they get closer to the White House. Our coverage will continue in just a minute.
There's a new prescription treatment called Remicade that could change your life by giving you lasting relief from the pain and stiffness of rheumatoid arthritis. Your doctor may add Remicade if you are on methotrexate already and not responding well. You take 1 dose of Remicade every 8 weeks after the first 3 doses. Of course, Remicade is not for everyone. Serious infections requiring hospitalization have been reported. If you are prone to or have a history of infections, currently have one, or develop one while taking Remicade, tell your doctor right away. There's a risk of serious infusion reactions with hives, difficulty breathing, and low blood pressure. Ask your rheumatologist about Remicade, or call today.
Moms don't like to talk about menopause, so maybe your mom never told you.
But you feel physical and psychological changes
long before menopause.
Try Estroven to help balance hormones naturally,
Gently, safely. Don't wait till menopause to get Estroven.
Is your asthma really under control?
Yes, but I still get short of breath.
And you wake up at night wheezing and coughing.
I just use my fast-acting inhaler.
But you use it almost every day.
Is that what you call control? Ask your doctor if Flovent is right for you. Prescription Flovent twice a day helps control the inflammation that can cause everyday asthma symptoms. Even helps improve lung function. Flovent won't replace fast-acting inhalers for sudden attacks. People switching from an oral steroid like prednisone to Flovent, an inhaled steroid, need to be especially careful. While adjusting to the switch, your body is not as able to heal after surgery, infection, or a serious injury. See your doctor if your asthma does not improve.
Now this is asthma control.
Next Saturday, John Stossel goes to Washington. Some politicians don't like that.
I'm going to fire whoever scheduled this interview.
Can government solve our problems? Listen to this. $1 billion of your tax dollars lost?
How can you not find billions of dollars?
John Stossel's Consumer Report on Washington next Saturday.
You know, it's hard finding the right program. No.
Go, Michelle.
Next.
The State Farm U.S. Figure Skating Championships. Men's final today, ladies final tonight at 9 on ABC.
Next.
Welcome back to our inaugural coverage. We're going to go straight to the parade itself. ABC's Terry Moran is in it, our new White House correspondent. Terry, give us a better impression than we're getting at a distance from what's happening.
Peter, what I can tell you is that this has been an extraordinary journey so far down Pennsylvania Avenue for the new president, and I can't imagine how he feels about it. The cheers have been mixed with jeers, as you've said, and at times the jeers have been louder. The protesters are clearly very well organized. They've turned out in force. And I must say, it has felt to me as if all of the boiling emotions of that long election contest have reappeared here on the streets of Washington. There is a lot of very nasty signage, if you will. Some of the signs are downright ill-mannered, and there's a great deal of concern you can tell on the faces of the security officers. This may prevent, although I don't know, President Bush from doing what presidents have done in the past, jumping out of the car and saying hello. I will say the substantial majority of people along this route are supporters, many of them ticket holders, but they have been, I think, organized by what may be a fringe element of people who are out here, but it's certainly something that must be reported because it can't be avoided, and it's something the president has had to deal with. He has said in the past that he wants to be president of all the people. When confronted with these kinds of demonstrations, he's been very generous, but this is a remarkable display for a president to see, and I can't imagine who the last president was who encountered something
Terry,
like
let me ask you this. Can you tell what they are protesting about, or is it general animosity?
Well, it's the kitchen sink. There's everything from the National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska to Mami Abu Jamal to the right to abortion, billionaires for Bush. I'm looking at Hassan. I almost don't want to repeat some of what I'm saying. It is a grab bag of angry people who may not be spoiling the parade, but are certainly impacting it.
Well put, Terry. Certainly not spoiling the parade for people at home, though maybe causing resentment among many people at home who have seen real vituperativeness on the streets of, and even worse, in Seattle and in Calgary, Alberta, at another big international meeting, and then at Prague in Czechoslovakia. And as any number of people have pointed out, there is a new internationalization of support, but so much of this, as Terry points out and as others have, seems to be the residue of the bitter divisions which have been caused by the election. We're not precisely sure why the president has stopped at this particular point, but the last time there were significant protests like this, during an inauguration in 1973, Richard Nixon, it was even worse. There were maybe 100,000 people, 25 to 100,000 people who then thronged to the inauguration to demonstrate against the president's policies in Vietnam and in Cambodia. Let's listen. Be the security forces who have asked them to stop, and the sound of a siren in Washington, which we hear outside our location now, is no great surprise. There's sirens all the time here as leaders and officials and occasionally important people come and go, but we have no idea why the inaugural parade has been stopped here just short of Freedom Plaza, which is at the western end of Pennsylvania Avenue. We'll go down to Lisa Stark, who's in Freedom Plaza. All right, Terry Moran is able to explain. Yes, Terry.
Well, Peter, I've been told that there is a bottleneck ahead of us towards the reviewing stand, and the security services do not want the president's car stopped here in front of Freedom Plaza, where there are several hundred demonstrators and riot police 5 deep. So they want to stop him a couple of 100 feet short so that his car does not stop in front of the protesters and perhaps incite them to more than just the the general vocalizing that they're doing here. Once this bottleneck ahead of us is cleared, I'm told, we will roll through and past the protests and on towards the White House. Okay. Once again, whether or not he gets out of the car is anybody's guess right now.
Well, here's the turn up just to the north side of the Treasury building, coming down in front of the White House itself. So that's an explanation we needed, because it looks somewhat different on television, as so often things do, because it looked for a moment there as if Mr. Bush had stopped right in front of the demonstrators. But Terry, you say he stopped short of them, and that we're not seeing it quite so accurately on the television.
They have stopped, Peter. I didn't quite hear your question.
I was just trying to figure out whether or not the president had stopped in front of some demonstrators or out of sight.
No, he actually stopped in front of a very large reviewing stand where people who have tickets and are obviously supporters of his are seated. So he's in what you might unfortunately have to call today friendly territory along Pennsylvania Avenue, and they didn't want him to have to come a couple hundred feet forward when there's a bottleneck and have to stop in front of Freedom Plaza. We are rolling now, though.
That's the other thing, of course, that the Secret Service always wants. The Secret Service, as I said, has become omnipresent in the presidential lives, but former President Bush, Mrs. Bush, brother Jeb, members of the family have all settled into the reviewing stand outside the White House by now. An elaborate structure put up every year. Colin Powell is at work, or trying to, several people on their cell phones. That's Gail Norton, the nominee to be the Secretary of the Interior on the left. There are any number of people, including Colin Powell, who are either trying to find out what is happening, or maybe he's calling home to say hello to somebody. Let's just stay on General Powell for a second there. Now, the Secret Service running alongside the car will give you some pretty good example now that the President's limousine is now moving more quickly than it did in the past. The point I was making is the Secret Service always wants access and always wants an exit route, which makes perfectly good sense. While the President has been coming along Pennsylvania Avenue, the Senate has approved, Senate went into session and has approved the nomination of 7 of Mr. Bush's cabinet secretaries. So Colin Powell is now the Secretary of State. There is a Secretary of Defense and Treasury and Energy and Agriculture and Education and Commerce. They all now have their jobs formally. Or at least they've approved their nominations, I think, at the point was made. They have to be sworn in, of course. Thank you, Madam. My colleague Nancy Gabriner, who always tries to keep us on the straight and narrow. As they come through Freedom Square, ABC's Lisa Stark is in there.
Peter, as the motorcade apparently went by here, the demonstrators who had quieted down for a while. It's been a long day. It's been cold, rainy. They were tired. They were energized again. They started shouting boo, making some obscene gestures, I will say, towards the motorcade. This is the moment they were waiting for. They had said what they wanted to do was to present to the world a country divided. They didn't want this to be people to just see people out celebrating the new president, and they succeeded, I think, in presenting a country divided. There were a couple of thousand, at least, demonstrators here in Freedom Plaza. Some of them are actually starting to leave now that the motorcade has gone by. I think not here, obviously, to see the parade as much as to make their point as the president drove by. Right next door, the reviewing stand here with the people who paid $50 a ticket to see the president, to see the parade, and they had mixed reactions to the demonstrators. Some of them said, this is what America's all about. It's a check and balance on the system. It's okay. Others said, what's the point? They're really a distraction. We don't want them here. Well, so mixed reaction here.
Thanks, Lisa, very much. They certainly have their opportunity to be seen and heard. As President Bush said in his inaugural address today, sometimes our differences run so deep it seems that we share a continent but not a country. But as we have heard, and as I think everybody in America knows, the country has enduring strength and the value of protest as well as support for the new president. But George Stephanopoulos, I think you'd agree that we haven't seen the absolute suspension of political differences on this day in order to wish the new man God's blessings.
No, we have not, Peter. But, you know, really, it's a cakewalk compared to our last really disputed election in 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes was inaugurated in secret because there was a fear he would be kidnapped. There were armed troops on the roofs to avert violence, and 2 Supreme Court justices even boycotted the ceremony. These protests so far, by and large, have been peaceful. There hasn't been any violence from what we can tell so far, any serious violence, and most of the country is prepared to give the new president a chance.
George, Josh Gerstein, one of our reporters at the White House, reports in a moment ago that the scene is remarkable. Offices that were being used hours ago are now stripped bare. The carpets all smell of cleaning fluid, which is wafting through the press room, which may be metaphorically a good idea. What's it like in there at the moment?
Boy, Peter, I was just thinking about that 8 years ago today while President Clinton was walking up Pennsylvania Avenue. I pretty much ran up Constitution Avenue to get to the White House, and when I entered my office, the press secretary's office in the White House, you could even see the outlines on the wall of where the pictures used to be. It's completely bare. There's nothing inside. As Ted mentioned before, the computers are disemboweled, but it's still pretty remarkable when you get to walk through those gates and realize that you actually are going to be working in the White House. 2 other things that are left behind, though, Peter. As you know, President Clinton left a note for President Bush when he arrives today, and there's a tradition in the press secretary's office as well. There's a bulletproof vest in the office, and each press secretary puts a note in for his successor. So when Ari Fleischer arrives there this afternoon, President Bush's new press secretary, he'll get a note from Jake Seward.
Of course, meant to be taken in good humor, not literally.
Absolutely. They all face the same attacks from the press.
And one of our other guests today who knows the family quarters of the White House very well is Carl Anthony. Carl, is the chaos over in the family quarters upstairs, do you think?
Yes, pretty much so, which is, really a great departure from the earlier years when, Woodrow Wilson couldn't even find his pajamas. Sometimes in the past, those moments in between were difficult. Sometimes the outgoing families' possessions weren't always properly removed. In the case of the Fillmores and the Pierces, the boxes were all mixed up. And but by now, certainly since the 1930s, under the chief usher's thumb, the entire staff works at a frenzied pace to remove all of the personal possessions and outfit the rooms in sort of a generic manner with the furnishings of the government warehouse material. Peter, I just want to add one other...
Can I just ask you one thing, though, just before you go on, Carl, because I'm always struck by the White House staff. The White House staff has been with the Clintons for 8 years, some of them in there for 25 and 30 years. They must go through their own emotional jolt at a moment like this.
Oh, I think so, but the one thing about them is the incredible level of professionalism. They are really the permanent family. The maids, the butlers, the electricians, but they do get close to the family. There's this wonderful story of the man who ran the clocks and who got very close to the little grandson of Jimmy Carter.
Thank you, Carl, very much. We're just going to guess that the president has stopped here. It's become almost, not every president has by any means, but it's almost obligatory now that the president get out and George W. Bush is out. In modern, President Reagan rode all the way to the White House in a limousine in 1981, but when Jimmy Carter got out in 1977, to the horror of the Secret Service of the day, even though he had notified them several weeks before the inauguration, he set a tone which George Bush, the father, revived when he and Mrs. Bush got out of the limousine not once but 3 times during the ride back to the White House. ABC's Terry Moran is down there on the street with them. Terry, did we know this was coming?
Well, I assume the Secret Service did. They seemed very well prepared for it. One of the reasons I think that President Carter was able to do it was because they didn't tell anyone. And he has certainly picked a spot which I can't see any protesters, and that is
I'm going to say that the tension of those protesters is completely evaporated, at least on the television screen.
That's right. The only thing I see are cowboy hats.
Well, they are just now to the east of the White House. You see there behind President Bush one of the white guardhouses that is up on a regular basis when Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House is closed off at that particular point to vehicle traffic. And as we've said before, some people would like the president to open Pennsylvania, not least of whom are the taxi drivers in the district who find it one added burden to get around the city when that particular street is closed off. Barbara Walters on inside the White House goings on at the moment.
Well, let me just tell you a little bit about the staff, because you were talking about it, Peter. There are 89 permanent members of staff, everything from carpenters to the people who do the flowers. There are 125 rooms. You don't think it's that big. And there are 10 bedrooms, supposedly, in the private area. I say supposedly because you can take some of them and make sitting rooms, like the daughters might want a bedroom and a sitting room, and President and Mrs. Bush may want a couple of sitting rooms. There is a little private kitchen upstairs that Mrs. Kennedy put in, so that the president, who says he awakens and starts at 5:45, not at 9 o'clock, as has been reported, can make a cup of coffee for his wife. And she, as we have read, and she said to me, is a very organized woman. She loves to clean. She loves to make lists. She will have everything in that house organized. And I think she'll be a very popular First Lady because she is determined, but she has a lot of charm and ease about her personality.
The twins, by the way, are not walking. They're staying in their car. But behind us, because we're across Lafayette Park here from the White House, you can get a real sense of Jeb Bush and the president's father, President Bush, energizing the crowd, not to mention the official inaugural announcer, who you will hear from time to time once the parade gets going in earnest. Michael Beschloss, we now, I think, agree this is a good tradition for the president to get out and be closer to the people.
I think it sure is, Peter, and of course it does go back to Jimmy Carter, and a big hallmark of the Carter campaign was that, unlike a president like Richard Nixon, I, Jimmy Carter, won't let myself get separated from you. And I think especially today, Peter, just imagine if George Bush had to remain for security reasons locked inside that car, couldn't follow this tradition that his father had followed and Jimmy Carter had followed. I think that would have made a statement that we probably wouldn't have wanted to see.
Indeed, and it certainly would have enabled those who want precisely to disrupt a day like this to have prevailed.
Absolutely, and they have been able to do that in history. Even in 1861, when Abraham Lincoln was about to get sworn in, he was brought on that famous train trip from Illinois. There were threats against his life, and Lincoln was even put in disguise so that he wouldn't be in danger of those, and that was exposed, and he was held up to ridicule.
Michael, so many lesser mortals, myself included, try to do our homework on these occasions. We get some, we don't get others. But tell the story of John Wilkes Booth and President Lincoln on Inauguration Day.
Well, that's one of the spookiest ones. As you know, I'm writing this book on the Lincoln assassination, and that's one of the most scary moments in it, which is that when Abraham Lincoln was sworn in the second time in March of 1865, just before the end of the Civil War, if you take a look at one of the photographs taken on that occasion, John Wilkes Booth is standing about 12 yards away from where Lincoln is sworn in and gives his inaugural address, just on those Capitol steps.
And is it true that at Lincoln's second inauguration, everybody was very nervous about taking the first step out onto the inauguration platform, and that finally it was Senator Douglas who took the first step?
Yes, Senator Douglas, his old antagonist, particularly in 1861. And Douglas, of course, had run against Lincoln for both president and senator. And so when Douglas was as hospitable as he was to Lincoln on that particular event, it gave you a sense that people were really coming together. And that's what we really have these inaugurals for, and maybe nowhere more so than a day like this after that contested election.
All right, so the President and Mrs. Bush are going to get back into the car because they haven't got far to go. The car will swing into the White House. And they will take a few minutes to themselves to freshen up after this and then come out to the inauguration stand, and the parade, as opposed to the procession, will begin in earnest. I hope you'll stay with us. I'm Peter Jennings in Washington. We'll be back in just a moment.